I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother me again in the rest of my life, I ain't giving them that shit. I can't. There's good friends of mine out on the shit. Well, he's the boss, you have to do it first. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is. The boss means that the boss is your boss.
Notti d'un tempo che fu, tre cavalieri da Spagna si partirono, dall'Abruzzi a Sicilia passarono e poi in Calabria si fermarono. 21 anni lavorarono sottoterra per fondare le regole sociali, leggi d'onori, di sangue e di guerra.
And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We're going to get into the last portion of the show. And, you know, over the last probably 2 years, we've talked a little bit about 'Ndrangheta, and sometimes it gets very hard to really describe really just what it is, because we've tried to explain the hierarchy, and believe me, it's like you need a fucking deciphering code to figure it out. It's just that difficult. But the best way to often do this is to give you an example. And there's stuff that is going on and has gone on, even as, you know, close to 2021, 2022, that show that 'Ndrangheta is here to stay. And 'Ndrangheta is actually on the move. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about a specific case. And this case is going to show you just how, I hate to use the word schemy, but just how Machiavellian they are in the way that they legitimize themselves. Toronto, for example, has always been the one spot that seems to pull at the pants leg of gangsters. It always has been from day one. In those old days, it was mainly the Catroni crime family, which ruled with an iron thumb between Ontario and Quebec. The Catronis, who many believe to be a mafia family, are actually not. They're what we call an Ndrina. An Ndrina is basically a Calabrian crime family, which by definition is 'Ndrangheta. Okay? It was Vic Catroni's leadership that allowed for the other Italian mafia families to sort of enter the fray. The Rizzutos only began because of Vic Catroni as the namesake. It really, let me rephrase this. The Rizzutos only become what they become because of Vic Catroni. And the reason why is because the namesake of the Rizzuto crime family, Niccolo Rizzuto, actually climbed the ranks within the Catroni crime family until eventually leaving and forming his own crime family to directly compete with the Catroni for turf, rackets, and territory. So really, Niccolo Rizzuto, who is a Sicilian gangster, really came up the ranks in 'Ndrangheta, which is very odd because you usually don't see things like that. But the Catronis were in business for 30 years before the Rizzutos even formed. So what you have a tendency of hearing all the time, especially people who cover Canada the wrong way, will be like, oh, the Rizzutos and the Catronis, the two. But people don't realize that the Rizzutos didn't come along until the 1970s. Catroni was there for 30 years before they even formed. And of course, you know, Montreal and Hamilton and Toronto became a pivot point for all of organized crime. Other than the Catronis, you also had the Papalia crime family, who really began in the same time period as the Catronis. And they were not really enemies because they were also Calabrian. They're an Ndrina. They also set up shop in Hamilton, Ontario, springing from what would be the Musitano crime family and the Lupino crime family. And they're 'Ndrangheta as well. So Canada has always really technically been not Cosa Nostra. It's been 'Ndrangheta. And like I said, the Rizzutos didn't really get on the field to play ball until the 1970s. And they're currently right now struggling to keep their heads above water. And then came the clans. The Coluccio clan came over from Canada, from Calabria, making themselves known. You have the Di Maria crime family, who's also an Ndrina and Calabrian. The Tavernaces, who are considered a part of the Salerno group, which is also Calabrian. And then you have just 'Ndrangheta. And so from the Sicilian side, really all you have left is the Contrera Caruana clan and the Rizzutos. And it's so to say, traditionally the Canada Mafia, or Canada being a mafia enclave, is really kind of a misnomer in every sense because it's always been 'Ndrangheta from day one. However, even, the fact that we saw Vic Catroni run his family and his business more so like Cosa Nostra. See, that's the difference with the Catronis. They were in Andrina, but they really probably followed more log lines closely and business-wise to Cosa Nostra than they did in 'Ndrangheta. And you might say, well, what's the difference? And aesthetically, I'm here to tell you that there isn't a lot of difference in how they operate in the 1940s and 50s. What is mainly different now is how the inner relationships are established. In Cosa Nostra, you don't have to be blood related at all. And in 'Ndrangheta, you have to be. And it's more important today than it was back in the old days. The other major difference is that Cosa Nostra seems to have little to no interest in diversifying itself into rackets that would make sense given the time period that we're actually in. Stock schemes, stock swindling, tech scams, political movements. Whereas 'Ndrangheta has. They have gone that direction. And the one thing that 'Ndrangheta did was to push the Sicilians out on their asses and take over the narcotics rackets, which they have done. And that's the big thing. Even going back to the days of Lucky Luciano, Sicilians always controlled those routes, the importation and the distribution. And as we know, Luciano was Neapolitan, right? So he had to work with them, but they were always Sicilian routes. And now you have 'Ndrangheta controlling every single facet of those rackets. Now they work with the Sinaloa cartel and other cartels to manufacture and distribute narcotics. Much of the Mexican supplies now come from actually Europe versus Colombia. 'Ndrangheta, foundationally, they look like a mafia family, but there is not one single head to the snake, if that kind of makes sense. So in Canada, though, so like when I tell you, so if I put 'Ndrangheta up, everybody's seen the mafia flowcharts. If I put 'Ndrangheta up, you're not going to see Jeff Canarsie at the top of all of 'Ndrangheta. That's not how it works as a huge organizational thing. You have different clans, different leaders of different clans in different territory. However, in Canada, this is the only place where there is a head of all of 'Ndrangheta. And, think of Canada like New York City in terms of commission. 'Ndrangheta has a ruling body in Canada and functions like New York does. However, outside of Canada, it doesn't work that way. In Italy, it's so widespread that it would almost seem as if a commission in Italy would be something like 40 guys. And that would just be insane. Sheer numbers tell the story. 'Ndrangheta is in every country. And the amount of membership that they have far surpass Cosa Nostra in every sense. And they have become what the Sicilian Mafia once was, which they no longer are. And I actually heard the other day somebody say that Canada was much better when the Catronis and the Rizzutos were in charge. They were the two main groups. Because everybody else sort of fell in line. And to some extent that is true, but in many others it's not. I've heard content creators stupidly say that 'Ndrangheta moving into Canada destroyed the Sicilian grip. And in fact, the truth is that's not even true because 'Ndrangheta has always been the powerhouse from day one. Always has been, always will be. However, the current version of 'Ndrangheta resembles something much more powerful and much more violent than any other previous version. And it wasn't a slow-moving tide that came in and the water slowly rose, eventually pushing guys off the pier. The water has always been there, and it's always been rising. And the difference is, as I said, Catroni aligned himself and did business more like a traditional Sicilian family. But this version of 'Ndrangheta we're seeing now is a juggernaut. And this version controls everything, pushing Sicilians out of the marketplace narcotics-wise, forcing them to have to take less profits and less cuts. We know that the Sicilians work hand in hand with 'Ndrangheta, but it's a business arrangement that truly supports the foundation of Calabria, Calabrians, and not the Sicilians. So in other words, Sicilians are getting a piece but there's not enough to help them grow, okay? The Sicilians, once the heads of the table, are now forced to sit at the children's table a couple of rooms over. And it's because of the tacit end of men like Toto Rina, Bernardo Provenzano, and Matteo Messina Denaro. And that changes the landscape in Italy. When those three men are gone, it changes the landscape. And the last true remaining guy who was building an empire in Sicily, as well as the United States, who had the capability, the power, and the intelligence to completely be like Toto Rina, was Frank Cali. Frank Cali was going to be the next Toto Rina, but Frank Cali was also an enigma because Frank Cali was an American Cosa Nostra boss who was as big in Italy as he was in New York. Imagine that. He carried weight here and he carried massive weight in Sicily. They called him a boss in Italy. He wasn't just a boss here, he was a boss in Italy too. And if there was a guy who could bridge gap, it would have been Francesco Cali. And he was well on his way. He would have been that guy. I think if Frank Cali had lived, he would have been the most powerful thing we have ever seen in American history. But perhaps what Ndrangheta has done better than most criminal organizations is legitimize their interests. Sure, some of it is traditional, like loan shark and gamble and extortion and construction. But they have overtaken social services in Italy. They have absorbed Fortune 500 companies. They've absorbed banks. If there is any port of entry into interfering with state and local programs, they've shown a willingness to be able to get themselves through the door. The other interesting facet is that they do not have informants. And that's one thing about Ndrangheta that differentiates them from any other organized crime group. They don't have fucking squealers. And so a couple of years ago when Italy was repossessing homes and neighborhoods and rebuilding them, revamping them, it was Ndrangheta who controlled the banks. They controlled the companies. They controlled the workers. They controlled every facet of that. When Ndrangheta needed a foothold into the government, they found ways to control everything from wages to bridge building. Bridges. You couldn't build a bridge without them signing off. That's how powerful they have become. The biggest thing, however, is you cannot dismantle them. They're too fast. They're too deep. The sheer amount of numbers prove you take 100 down means nothing to them in terms of organization and moving forward. And some of the indictments we've seen, 250 arrested, 400 arrested, that would have completely decimated 2 of the 5 families in New York completely. Not in Italy. It doesn't even dent them. They have overtaken hospital complexes, the healthcare industry. Anything that you can imagine, they have put their hands into. They own the cookie jar. So we're going to talk about somebody in 2019, a guy by the name of Angelo Figliomeni. He was picked up on hundreds of wiretaps. He is, according to the RCMP, the head of Ndrangheta in Canada. Once again, this is obviously according to Canadian authorities, but this is the boss of boss version of organized crime in Canada. So Ndrangheta, like I said, does not have one man that runs everything, but in Canada they do. And that man, according to the Canadian authorities, is Angelo Figliomeni. It doesn't mean that the Rizzuto leftovers are done. In fact, truly, the last remaining Sicilian conglomerate in Canada is the Rizzutos. And Figliomeni, by all accounts, was a construction megastar, property megastar, known hundreds of businesses in Canada. Quite the resume. However, what authorities would come to find out is that Figliomeni, was behind a $30 million real estate deal in Toronto, was having problems. And the problem was they needed investors, right? And they do get them. But one by one, the investors start to begin to drop off because things aren't moving as quickly. Guys are getting nervous and not wanting to lose the deal. Figliomeni contacts his real estate developer. And the two on the phone discuss a strategy. And what comes from that call is 2 men more or less saying, well, let's get some fucking money from the investors and then just fuck them over. Who cares? What are they going to do? So in other words, they wanted to acquire $2 million from each investor and tell them, hold off, we're going to ask for a little less money this time. And then they were just going to rob them and then tell them to fuck off. They were going to tell him to fuck off, keep the money. What were they going to do? This guy's the head of Ndrangheta. They can't do shit. And then they would still be going to other investors who really wanted to put serious money into this development deal. And that's Mafia 101. The bottom line is money. It always is going to be. The fact that you have a boss in any capacity on his own, controlling a vast empire with deals beginning in the $30 million range in an area smaller than New York City is fucking insane to me. And what's interesting in all of that is that it's Toronto. Because like we mentioned before, many other crime families have tried to hold on to Toronto for all they're worth. And anything, just surrounding Toronto itself is 10 other organizations. And we're not even talking about the Russians, the Triads, the Albanians, the bikers. And this is what makes Canada a hard sell for me in terms of moving operations into that country. You have too many groups. We say this all the time about Philadelphia, right? That you have 100 guys operating in a small section of the state only to be surrounded by the DeCavalcantes in Jersey, the Camorra in New Jersey, and then you got representations of all 5 families. You don't have much room to move, which is why Philadelphia has expanded into other cities and states. They have to. It's survival. So if you look at Canada, it's just a humongous place in terms of just miles. However, it seems as if all of these groups operate within 50 miles, 100 miles of one another. And that's a lot of the reason why in the last decade you've seen 100 or more plus murders in Canada. It's turf beefing at its best. Full control. Ndrangheta, however, has seemed to align with about everybody, but a few small groups. And it's long been the Calabrian desire to remove anybody who is not Calabrian, especially if you were Sicilian, which, would make sense as to why Leonardo Rizzuto was almost killed, 2 years ago. Calabrians want it all, and they want no interference from Sicilians whatsoever. And I'm not saying that the Calabrians pulled off that move, but I wouldn't say they didn't do it either. And there's a whole hell of a lot of jockeying going on in Canada. So let's go back to Angelo Figliomeni for a second. According to investigators, Angelo has overtaken the construction, gambling, extortion, and loan sharking rackets in Toronto. And it's really the first time that we have seen really one group control all of it in 100 years. And I was told by a source, who I'm not going to divulge here on this show, that they're controlling everything. 2 weeks after police intercepted that call between Figliomeni and his real estate developer, the RCMP and the Crown moved in on the group and arrested Figliomeni and 8 of his associates. So there were 9 arrests. Police alleged that they alleged a lot of different things, but they believed that Figliomeni had moved $70 million through casinos, basically washing his money in just 5 years. That's an insane amount of money. One man with 8 associates. That's fucking crazy. Figliomeni would argue through attorneys that the RCMP made a mistake and they were just making more out of the conversation than really it was. And what is interesting is that even with the calls, the Canadian authorities would stay the charges against Figliomeni and his associates. Now, keep in mind, Canada, just for being a member of organized crime, is a felony and comes with a minimum of 5-year term. And when the government stayed the charges, it meant they chose not to pursue them in court. The Canadian prosecutors stated that they had evidence to support criminal proceeds being laundered through real estate dealings all over Toronto. Through the wiretaps, the crux of the relationship between Figliomeni and real estate dealers was pretty cut and dry. If a real estate dealer wanted a building and he was bidding and another company bid, Figliomeni stepped in and made sure that the opposition company were stopped immediately. In one case, a plastic company hired a friend of Figliomeni, who was actually a land developer. There was an issue over price, and Figliomeni was called in to dispute the issue. And the reason why that is important is because it shows the power that Figliomeni allegedly has, as both sides agreed to sit down, which means that Figliomeni is playing both sides against the coin, but he has the ultimate say. That's power. Rizzuto didn't have that type of power. Not like this. He had it, but not like this. Further, at least not in Toronto. Further investigation showed that Figliomeni has a massive real estate portfolio himself. On paper, Figliomeni is a simple baker and a sandwich maker. However, he owns 8 homes spread throughout the greater Toronto area. 7 other homes are owned through a corporation or business that Figliomeni directs. Investigations further showed that Figliomeni was off the record on a board of major banks in Canada, which sent massive red flags to law enforcement. But these banks, and we're talking about BB&T, big banks, these banks refused to cooperate with Italian authorities. That's fucking power, my friends. So this investigation was dubbed Project Syndicado by Canadian authorities, and it ended before it ever really began. In 2021, it was found that Canadian authorities illegally wiretapped Figliomeni. They also alleged that Canadian authorities illegally listened to tape calls between Figliomeni and his attorneys, which was the crux of their case. They didn't get the right procedural stuff done to do that. Judges found that the OCCRP, which is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is the investigating branch of organized crime, had in fact broken the law a dozen times. They had seized over $35 million in assets which belonged to Figliomeni and his associates, 27 homes, Rolexes, high-end sports cars like Ferraris and Lamborghinis, and boats had to be returned to them. And in Canada, they can, without hesitation, freeze and take your assets without a conviction. And Europe is the same way. If they believe your assets are from a crime, they can seize it before there was ever a fucking conviction or a trial. Here, we call that asset forfeiture. And mostly, the FBI will seize assets, but really they focus more so on freezing bank accounts and cash on hand. And while they can do that prior to a hearing here as well, typically all we ever see after arrest warrants is they just freeze bank accounts. That's typically what we always see. So some differences in how each country sort of handle this, I wanted to give an example of. Eventually, this case was toppled, but it didn't stop Figliomeni from buying more assets since 2021 until today. He has bought 2 more homes in the York region of Canada worth around $3.5 million. And it seems like the game plan of Andrangheta, because Vito Silli, who was an associate allegedly of Figliomeni, and his alleged number 2 is a carbon copy of Figliomeni. He also has purchased multiple homes in the Vaughan area. So where the rub comes in, because there's always a rub with this, right? Shit, I just lost my place. Hold on a second. Let's see. Okay, so where the rub comes in is that in Canada, okay, this is going to be some legalese shit, so just hold your purses for a minute. In Canada, all real estate companies have to do a hard background check on all of their clients. And the reason why they have to is because Canada has laws about anti-money laundering laws. But the problem is there's little oversight into looking at these real estate companies, and their feet are not being held to a fire. So in other words, these companies are supposed to like red flag anything that looks goofy. They're very hardcore about background real estate companies doing hard background checks on their clients, but there's really no oversight on any of that. So there's a lot of unscrupulous shit that happens. Okay, so that's the point I'm trying to make. And it's become a massive money laundering issue all over Canada, and especially in the Toronto area. And what Andrangheta has managed to do is circumvent the laws and hide their own corporations behind a wall of anonymous ownership structures. It's as easy as putting the home in the name of a friend and then having that friend rent out the home. And this is just typical of what Andrangheta is doing. And that's just an easy way of understanding it. They're not just hiding the money, but they're also making money. Andrangheta often overpays for homes, inflating the neighborhood price, and overdoing the maintenance of the yard, throwing it into the market into a schism where it almost forces others in the neighborhood to adhere to upgrading their property as well. You hear about this all the time. This is why neighborhoods attack the guy that doesn't mow his fucking lawn, because they feel like that brings the property level down. Well, when Andrangheta moves into a neighborhood, they jack up everything on the house that they own, and it almost forces everybody else to compete. Or Andrangheta will buy multiple homes in these neighborhoods, raise all of the homes to the same level, and now they've put people that normally could move there or afford to move there they can't afford it. And then Ndrangheta just sells the homes and they make massive profits. You don't see American Mafia guys doing this. You just don't. So from what authorities knew about Figliomeni, and keep in mind, these are just assertions. I'm not saying that they're true. I'm just saying these are assertions. But Figliomeni arrives in Canada sometime we know in the early 2000s. He comes over from Calabria, and he has a past of weapons charges, so he really shouldn't even be in the country. It's amazing to me. I can't get into Canada with 2 felonies. This prick comes over from Calabria in the 2000s off weapon charges, and they let him in. It's just, he was actually convicted in Italy in absentia, or absentia, depending on how you want to say it, for mafia association. The OCCRP have made claims that Figliomeni and his group have absorbed loan sharking, gambling, and extortion in the Toronto area and have used those proceeds to launder through major banking institutions. But we also know from this case that those charges failed to stick. And the case files show that Figliomeni, according to the CCRP, the OCCRP, has ties to Danny DiMeo, who is the owner of Cal Queen West Developments. Wiretaps picked the two up, Figliomeni and DiMeo, discussing things in code. And one of the things that DiMeo allegedly has done is control a lot of the zoning efforts in Brampton. Zoning. You need extra land, you need this, you need that. He's the guy to go see. But he's also a fucking gangster. In further conversations, Figliomeni allegedly discussed 2 different land purchases through a third party and the total of $30 million. DiMeo says on the call that the third party, quote unquote, has to buy in Richmond Hill. Make sure he fucking buys there because that is the deal for $30 million for both. DiMeo's attorney claimed that this was normal business as usual. It was nothing more than a land sale deal, nothing more. But going back to the original deal that the two discussed that we mentioned earlier in this part of the show, where it was said, fuck them over. Remember when I said that? What had happened was that investors had paid a deposit to purchase some real estate, but breached that agreement. And on the call, DiMeo is basically telling Figliomeni, who had known the third party, that they would have to forfeit their deposit. In other words, fuck them, right? That's what it is. So it's worth noting that when police raided the offices of DiMeo, they found nothing illegal about his business. All the records that they asked for were handed over. Everything looked good, nothing askew. And what made authorities wonder was because Figliomeni, through Vito Silli, had deposited $460,000 to Cal Queen West Developments. A second deposit was made for $230,000 and then an additional $100K. And all of those tied back to Figliomeni. But when reporters looked into the case, they couldn't find a single bit of evidence to support that any cash transfers came from Figliomeni at all to Cal West. So in other words, government didn't have shit. Aside from buying homes, police wiretaps show that Figliomeni intervened in a dispute between 2 Toronto area real estate developers. One happened on one October 2018 phone call records show a conversation between Figliomeni and Joe Sargo, or Scro. I don't know. SGRO, you guys figure it out. He was a developer in Vaughan. SGRO, Scro, is a business partner of Vic DeZen, the Canadian plastic industry mogul behind the Zen group of companies, which also works in the real estate development business. Transcripts show that Figliomeni and Scro discuss issues involving one particular development, outlining to Figliomeni how he had met with a man named Tony. Scro tells Figliomeni that the meeting got heated. Figliomeni signs off with "say hi to Vic." Scro said in an email response that Figliomeni had called him about a dispute that the Zen group and the DZen were having with Tony DeCicco, a Vaughan developer. They had neighboring properties fronting Highway 27 in Vaughan and that they disagreed over the path of access through the thoroughfare, Scro said. Scro said that he did not know Figliomeni very well, yet he called him like 100 times, right? He added that he had no idea what kind of a relationship Figliomeni had with DeCicco or why Figliomeni would even intervene on DeCicco's behalf. Mr. Figliomeni basically signaled a willingness for the adjacent owner DeCicco to resolve the issue with us. Scro wrote to reporters saying that Figliomeni asked nothing from us. It was paid nothing by us for his intervention. Mr. DeZen and I have no idea whether Mr. Figliomeni was paid anything for his intervention or precisely what the relationship is or was with the adjacent property owner. DeZen also said that he had no connections with Figliomeni. I do not recall ever meeting him, speaking to him, or being introduced to him, Mr. DeZen said. I do not have a personal business relationship or any familiarity with Mr. Figliomeni, nor did I have a relationship with him earlier. So in the end, the government had bupkis, nothing, zero, zilch, nada. All the accusations they made proved to be more, circumstantial than provable, which is exactly why they refused to prosecute in the end. And one of the things that Europe has done, right, and we talk about this all the time, is they follow the money. And more often than not, they seize massive bank accounts because they know how you truly stop the mafia is to hit them at their core, is to decapitate how they earn. And that's the lesson that America nor Canada has apparently learned how to do. And the interesting thing here is that in Andromeda, one of their strongest assets is moving money legitimately, properly, without ever getting fucking caught. It's one thing to have, it's just one thing that they've done extremely well. They almost have revolutionized how money laundering works. And that's the only way you're ever going to nail Andromeda or the mafia for that. Forfeiting money is one thing, but cutting all of those purse strings that have become almost an impossible task for law enforcement. And this is why Andromeda has become who they've become. In all facets of organized crime, be it the mafia, be it narco traffickers, those who are able to bury the money and make the money work for them succeed. Look at Walter White. He establishes a money washing system through car washes. Same thing here, just on a different level. It's what Michael Corleone wanted to do through Immobiliari in The Godfather 3. That horrid version nobody wants to watch. It was about legitimizing oneself. And Andromeda has found a way to do it. And until authorities can figure out how the system works and those that are involved, it's going to keep moving in the same direction. And so what does this mean for Canada? Well, some have laid claims that the bikers are in a war with Andromeda. It's not true. Listen, the Hells Angels are tough, but they can't take on Andromeda. You just can't. They're too big. And what you do have is smaller fringe biker groups vying for power against bigger biker groups. And it's become oversaturated, and so much so that groups are now bumping up against one another in ways we haven't seen before, and they're fighting and warring over every inch of turf they can get. And you'll likely see, you're going to see some groups merge, and maybe the merge is a bad phrase, right? But groups are going to join forces with Andromeda. Everybody has to eat. And if the crocodile is going to allow food to fall from its jaws, then you have to be willing to wait for the scraps. And this is exactly what's happening in Canada. That's why we've seen the bloodletting. It's not an active war between this group and that group. It's just a lot of jockeying and positioning. That's why when Scott Bernstein says, the Hells Angels are fighting the mafia. No, that's not what's going on. That's not what's going on at all. Andromeda's power is insane. They control worlds divided by oceans. Vincenzo Maya was determined to find out who killed. This is a part of Angelo Figliomeni. I just wanted to bring in this. There's a guy named by the name of Vincenzo Maya, who was determined to find out who had killed his brother Carmelo, who was a leader of a faction of the feared Andromeda crime group, who was gunned down on the streets of Salerno, which is a coastal city in southern Italy, in 2018. So Vincenzo Maya comes to Canada. He comes to Canada because his brother was killed in Italy. Why do you have a guy who was killed in Italy? Why is his brother coming to Canada to talk to anybody? Wouldn't you want to talk to somebody in Salerno? So he gets on a plane and he flies to Toronto. Maya wanted to talk to Angelo Figliomeni, who is 61, who Canadian police have accused of leading a faction of the Andromeda so powerful that it dictates events in Salerno from across an ocean. Quote unquote, they know who shot said Maya on a wiretap quoted in court documents in Italy, where authorities were investigating him for his alleged involvement in organized crime. After Italian police notified their counterparts in Toronto about Maya's impending journey across the Atlantic, the agencies began working together. Italian officers were watching Maya as he cleared customs and immigration in Toronto's Pearson International Airport on the evening of March 31st of 2019. Maya's trip to Canada to speak with Angelo Figliomeni, which was previously reported by the National Post, underscores the power of Ndrangheta faction he allegedly leads in the Greater Toronto area, according to Italian and Canadian authorities and experts. Figliomeni declined to comment through his lawyer about this story, while Italian court documents show that Maya thought he had information about who might have killed his brother. There was no allegation that Figliomeni was in any way responsible for that murder. The episode also highlights problems Canada has in prosecuting organized crime groups due to what experts say are overly broad interpretations of laws meant to protect individual rights. The Canadian security intelligence apparatus, inclusive of the police, does not have the same protections and does not have the same benefits that the international partners have when it comes to investigating transnational organized crime. Stephen Schneider, who was a criminology professor at St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, said that Italian authorities are very frustrated by the fact that alleged Ndrangheta members have found security in Canada, but there's little they can actually do. There is just case after case after case of offenders who otherwise would be in jail in the United States or Italy that are roaming free here in Canada. So, like we said, Figliomeni was previously convicted on weapons charges in Italy and still faces charges there, where court documents show that he's wanted for Mafia association. But he's safe in Canada, where the Mafia association charge is not an extraditable offense. In fact, it doesn't even exist in the Canadian legal code. Vittorio Rizzi, who is a deputy director general of Italy's public security department, said that inconsistencies in laws between countries challenge international efforts to combat Ndrangheta. That's a clue, because that's what's going to come next. They're eventually going to have international law that is going to bypass this. I'm just telling you. The misalignment of the legal system is a constant in cooperation activity, said Rizzi, who leads an initiative against Ndrangheta involving law enforcement in 18 countries, including Canada. Some years after Figliomeni left Italy, he set up in Canada. He becomes the prime suspect in a major organized crime investigation by Toronto's York Regional Police, which led to charges that his organization had laundered illicit funds. But prosecutors abandoned the case after it was shown that police had listened to calls between defendants and their attorneys, and charges against Figliomeni and others were thrown out. The collapse of the case, known as Project Syndicado, which we said earlier, added to a long list of Canada's failed efforts to prosecute organized crime, which experts blame mainly on two quirks of the legal system. Number one, an obligation for prosecutors to disclose to defense attorneys more information than other countries, which can lead to a lengthy wrangling over what can be shared or what must be shared, plus a separate law requiring cases go before a province's superior court to be completed within 30 months of the charges being laid out. And those laws make it almost virtually impossible to prosecute certain criminal and threat convergence cases in Canada, according to a recent report by the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies, a Washington, D.C. based security consulting firm. That's what they say, that it's impossible to prosecute. So there is extremely limited provisions to protect sensitive information, informants, or investigative techniques, et cetera, et cetera. And the decision to drop the case against Figliomeni and his associates frustrated the officers who worked on Project Syndicado. York Regional Police had spent $8 million and involved 500 officers in what they touted as the largest organized crime investigation in their history. Let's see. Let's see. Nope. I'm just looking through my notes here. Some of this stuff is just unimportant. Okay, so that's a lot of the reason why those cases have folded. There are certain benefits to being in Canada and certain things that aren't. But as far as where Figliomeni may stand, Canada's good for him, right? Because you judge it just by the huge amounts of cash and possessions that police confiscated in 2019. They seized more than $35 million from bank accounts that included $1 million in cash, the equivalent amount of jewelry and Rolex watches, as well as luxury cars, including a Ferrari valued at over $1 million. Police also restrained 27 properties, meaning they could not be sold, worth $24 million. And all of this had to be given back to Figliomeni and his associates after the prosecutor decided not to pursue the case. So just looking at sort of Figliomeni's background, Italian court documents that I went through actually showed that his family was involved in politics and crime in Salerno, and they ran deep, including a relative who served as mayor before he was sent to prison as an 'Ndrangheta member. His father, Vincenzo Figliomeni, known locally as Il Brigante or the Bandit, was also an 'Ndrangheta member, and according to Italian court documents, he was murdered outside of his home in Salerno in '88. His clan had been at war with a rival group, and he was shot twice in the head and torso with a shotgun, according to Italian media reports. As we know, Figliomeni is from Salerno, which we know is a town in southern Calabria, but now his base from operations is in suburban Toronto. It's alleged he has influence over 'Ndrangheta clans back home in Salerno in a situation that Italian authorities have described as unprecedented, meaning it's never happened before. This is something we have never seen in Italy, said Fausto Lamparelli, who is the senior director of the Italian State Police at a 2019 press conference in Toronto announcing charges against members of the Figliomeni group. The thing is, it just shows you. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. So in 2019, mob violence on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean brought authorities to Canada and Italy together to investigate specifically the Salerno group, dubbed Canadian 'Ndrangheta Connection Number 2 by Italian authorities. The collaborative investigation exposed the power of the faction operating in Toronto, according to a report by Italy's anti-mafia division, the anti-mafia group there. Figliomeni's group had allegedly become embroiled in a war with a rival crime family clan in the Greater Toronto Area, city of Vaughan, in 2017. So I want you to pay attention because I'm going to say this again. Figliomeni's group had allegedly become embroiled in a war with a rival crime clan in 2017, which included attempted murder, drive-by shootings, and arson, according to York Regional Police, who launched Project Syndicado later on to investigate. Now go back to Canada in 2017 and type in murders in Canada in 2017. That's when all of this shit started. That's it. Meanwhile, violence in Salerno, Calabria, has exploded. The murder of Carmelo Maya, we've talked about that. We've talked about his father traveling here to want to find out what happened to his son. And the RCMP knows that Maya had a dinner meeting with Figliomeni at the home of Luigi Vescio, who runs the Fratelli Vescio funeral homes in the Greater Toronto Area, and he was charged in Italy for alleged mafia association. Vescio did not respond to any requests where I got some of this information. The fact that Maya took a flight to Canada to see Figliomeni is a very big indication of the power shift that's happened in Toronto. Wiretap showed that Maya was, like I said earlier, trying to get answers about his brother's murder in the middle of a discussion about facial skincare, using other guests to try the high-end French brand La Mer. And the funny thing is they were all caught on wiretaps, and Vescio says, all these actors and actresses use this shit. I'll give you a sample this evening. And he goes upstairs to find the cream, and he leaves Figliomeni and Maya alone together. And as Figliomeni muses about getting a facelift, Maya brings the conversation back to the reason for coming to Toronto. I came specially to see you. Otherwise, I don't know what the fuck I came here for. It certainly wasn't facelifts or face cream. It's unclear, according to the wiretaps, what happened next, but Maya appears to have left Canada pissed off and embittered without his cream. I'm sorry. I know it's macabre and it's horrible to laugh at this shit, but the guy's sitting at a table. First of all, he's sitting with the head alleged of Andromeda, who is a shot caller back in Syndicado and living in Canada, right? His brother got whacked. He'd like to find out some information. Meanwhile, you have this other prick who is a fucking owns crematoriums and a fucking funeral homes trying to sell him fucking cream. Yeah, the actors and the extras use all this fucking cream. And he's telling him this, I'm going to go look for some. I'll be right back. And he looks over at Figliomeni like, the fuck am I doing here? And he says, I wonder what it would be like to get a facelift. Motherfucker, I'm here to talk about my brother. I don't know why that's so goddamn amusing to me. You know why? Because I picture myself sitting there going, motherfucker, I ain't here for no face cream. Fuck you and your face cream. What happened to my brother? I can only imagine him leaving that house. What in the fuck? But it just shows. It just shows the power of it. Fucking face cream and facelifts. It just shows that the power of Andromeda. You've never had a guy that controls Canada and is calling shots in Syndicado. It's never happened. And that's just shows you the power that Andromeda has. This is a guy who has weapon charges. What the fuck is he doing in Canada? I can't get in Canada with 2 fucking stupid felonies, but this motherfucker can? Whose dick you got to suck to get into Canada? But that's my point. And the reason why I brought that up is because he's very powerful. And I guarantee you, he has, to some extent, infiltrated, if we believe who he is, government. Because why the fuck else is he still there? You can't get in with a fucking DUI if you're American. But no big deal, weapons charges. It never hurt nobody. Anyway, that's going to be it for this week. In the meantime, we do have, I swear to God, even if I have to back it off another week, the new podcast is coming out called The Diner. And we got some other things cooking. Keep it dialed in, and we will see everybody here next week, same time, same bad channel. And I'm going to try to get in a live, Mob Talk Radio Live. We can talk about Gambino and laugh about face cream and whatever the fuck else. Be good to one another. We'll see everybody next week.